Hi, I'm Tara, and welcome to Let's Do Books. Email me at tara@thelesbianreview.com with any questions or comments, or come join our Facebook group, The Lesbian Review Book Club. I'm thrilled because I'm joined today by Lee Lynch. She's the author of the classic lesfic book, The Swashbuckler, as well as one of my recent favorites, Rainbow Gap, both of which are available everywhere from Bold Strokes Books. Lee is here today to talk about other people's books. Authors are readers too, so I'm asking her about what lesbian fiction books she loves. Welcome, Lee.
Hiya, Tara.
So, can you start by telling us a little bit about how you discovered lesbian literature?
Sure. I actually wanted to start by saying how grateful I am. There are a huge number of things. One is that you're doing this show so that readers and writers through you can communicate and maybe learn a little bit about one another. And I'm grateful for people like you, and as I've told you, you remind me of my wife, Elaine, and because you're so astute around literature and so passionate, especially about lesbian literature, and that's very unusual to see in someone who's also willing to contribute to that literature and culture, and not just by reading the books, but by making sure people know about authors, know about the books. So thank you for all the work you're doing.
Oh goodness, okay, you're making me blush a little bit. That is so kind of you to say. I really do appreciate that.
And so going from there, I'm grateful that I came out as early as I did. I was 15, and it opened up a world to me that so many women didn't have access to, because the role of women in society traditionally is not being a lesbian.
Can I just ask a question about that?
Yeah.
Because when I read The Swashbuckler last year, and you used the phrase, or maybe it wasn't in Swashbuckler, it was in Toothpick House. So when I read Toothpick House, Annie would talk about coming out, but it felt like it was different from how it's used now. Because how it's used now, I only ever see people talking about actually telling other people about that they're lesbian or that they're bisexual or whatever. But in that book, it was more like when you figure that moment out. So when you say that you were 15, were you able to be public about it, or is that when you figured it out for yourself?
As I said, you're very astute. You're the first one to mention that, and I have thought about it. Thought about writing about it, actually. Yeah, when I came out, it was a matter of coming out. It had nothing to do with public. It just meant I discovered I was a lesbian and started living my life as a lesbian. Does that answer your question?
It does, absolutely. Thank you.
But at the same time, it wasn't a foreign thing to come out to somebody. So we had both uses. And this was 1960, to put it in context. That, in my experience, we had both uses. And I grew up on the East Coast, I lived in New York City. So I think I was pretty up on the lingo of the times.
Mm-hmm.
So the gratitude then extends to the fact that my girlfriend I was pretty isolated and overprotected. Susie was very adventurous. And Susie was the one who met a woman who was a lesbian, so we could figure out that's what we were. Again, I not only had the privilege of figuring out who I was right away, but learning about the culture, being in New York where it was accessible, and finding books at that age. And what we had then were pulps and Radclyffe Hall. So Radclyffe Hall's Well of Loneliness was major for me. Yes, it was depressing, scary, painted us in a bad light at some points, but it was classic literature. It was really well written. And I still think it's the greatest lesbian novel. I wish I could write like that. And I completely identified with not only Stephen Gordon in the book, but I saw around me when I was with gay people, which I couldn't be too often because my parents didn't know, that this so-called stereotypes that she wrote about were real. The suicidal lesbians, the mixed up lesbians, the lesbians who couldn't deal with who they were and, ended up with guys, even after having had experiences as lesbians. So, not only was this really important to me personally because it reflected my life, good or bad, but in terms of literature, and at that time I was reading, real grown-up stuff. Yeah, I was reading Sartre in junior high, and I don't know, Victor Hugo, and things like that. And Radclyffe really, she was their equal, as far as I was concerned. It was a formative book, and it was a book in whose footsteps I wanted to follow, because I knew I wanted to be a lesbian writer. Partly because I felt there was a need for our literature, but also because I felt so good reading it. I felt so validated, again, good or bad, that I wanted to give that to other women. So my life path was formed at that point. The characters were beautifully drawn. The story was beginning, middle, end, and very literally presented. The settings were great. I mean, she just did it all right.
How did you find it?
The whole story is that Susie and I would go down to the village, and the gay kids knew where to go to get books, and that's where we found the ladder, although you weren't supposed to buy it until you were 21. I got a feeling for these books, and I didn't have any money, and I didn't buy poems, but they were passed around. Everybody had to read them. Everybody was so excited, whether the lesbian died at the end, or married a guy, or went off in the sunset with a woman, which I don't think happened too much. Maybe some Valerie Taylor. It just, seeing ourselves in print meant so much. It was important, even to the people who didn't read too much. So I was reading Anne Bannon and Valerie Taylor and Ben Packer and Anne Aldrich, who was Ben Packer, and on and on. I wrote an essay once called Cruising the Libraries, and I did a lot of that. I used to spend a lot of time in the criminology sections because that's where you could read about lesbians. They'd it'd be a book about criminal women in prison or something like that. And so there'd be lesbian relationships mentioned in a very negative way, but it didn't matter because there we were. And we were considered juvenile delinquents. I mean, it was illegal back then to do what we did.
Right.
Yeah. So all of those books, Bevo Brinker and the other books, and Valerie Taylor's Erika Frohmann stories, which Nightwood, did they release all of them? I think so. Those were especially important because Valerie set them in Nazi Germany, I believe, somewhere over there during those times, and addressed these questions. Valerie was a Quaker. Valerie was a very progressive Quaker, and I'm proud to say that we became friends later, and communicated a lot, and I visited with her. She was a bisexual woman, had 2 or 3 sons, and her worldview was very open. And I think she tried to incorporate that in her books. her book Rice and Beans that she wrote. I think it was her last or next to last book. And at that point, she was not very together. When I saw her books in manuscript, they needed a lot of work. So we're very, very fortunate that Barbara Greer and Donna McBride went ahead and published Rice and Beans. And in that one, Valerie addressed social issues beyond. She used a lesbian couple, but the poverty of Tucson, Arizona, and how they survived, and how people without anything were more accepting of one another, or at least in this book were. And so that probably influenced me a lot, because they made some connections that the other pulps did not make. And she was trying for something bigger than just a story of a one woman and what she went through with. But this is a picture of society of lesbians within a greater society, and in particular a very poor society of bonding minorities. What was your question?
So my question was how you first discovered lesbian literature.
And I found Radclyffe Hall.
Yeah.
You were asking about the Well of Loneliness. I lived in Flushing, New York. We had a movie theater called the Paramount on Main Street, and next to it was a stationery store. It had a rack of books. Goodness knows why the Well of Loneliness was on that rack. It makes you believe in a higher power. But there it was, and I must have used my movie money to buy it. Didn't cost a whole lot for books back then, maybe 35 cents or something.
Right. Did you find it before or after you knew you were lesbian?
After.
Okay.
And it does not, the cover did not say, "This is a lesbian book, Lee, by me." You developed a sense, right, of what was variant. Jeannette Foster wrote a book called Variant Women in Literature, by which she meant lesbians. And that sense of variance is like gaydar. And, you were just so hungry at that age and at that time for anything about gay people. So anyway, I found that one in a stationery store.
So what were some of the other books that really, when you encountered them, because it sounded like you enjoyed the pulps, but they didn't necessarily always really touch you, but what were some of those books that you read and you had that kind of an aha moment or a connection with them?
Okay, so Well of Loneliness, and Valerie Taylor.
Yeah.
I guess we have to jump then to Desert of the Heart by Jane Gould. Mm-hmm. And I'm in college. I turned 21. I subscribed to the Ladder. I send poetry to Barbara Greer, who was then editor. We develop a relationship. She gives me assignments. I did a lot of research about variant or lesbian women in literature. Out of the blue, she sent me Desert of the Heart. Again, the quality of the writing, the universality of the story, the great setting in the Nevada casino, and the happy ending. This had a happy ending. Mm-hmm. It was as powerful to me as The Well of Loneliness. And by that time, I had developed to the point where, I was ready for happy endings. I forgot one in college, Djuna Barnes' Nightwood. Mm-hmm. I was completely obsessed by that one, and did a paper on it, and one of my professors said, "Oh, I'm going to do a book. Would you?" But I knew that meant, you're going to do the grunt work. I just was not interested in following a man's desire to write about a lesbian writer. it really turned me off. But the book itself, by that time, I don't know how many times I had read it, and of course Djuna Barnes rejected the label of lesbian. I was one of the silly people that went to Patchen Place in New York where she lived. And I didn't leave her a rose in her mailbox, but left her a thank you note for writing to Nightwood, which was a weird, almost experimental book. I think you probably read it. And it made me want to write something like that, which was good and bad. So, but again, emotionally, the characters were weird, wild, sick. It still wasn't one I wanted, but I just was so impressed by her writing abilities that it took me a long time to get over wanting to write like her. And once I did, I could write like me, which was a good decision. So, Djuna Barnes was my next the connection there. And then Desert of the Heart, which was so eye-opening. It was like being put in the middle of the open spaces of the desert and seeing that there was possibility all around, that there was life, that there was love, that nobody was sick in that book.
Was that the first lesbian fiction book that you read that had a happy ending?
It may well have been. It probably, was in a book that I really was big for me. Mm-hmm. Yes, it would have been. And I'm sorry I ever saw the film.
No, that is okay.
The book itself was so real. It was so possible. Yeah.
Yeah. I remember coming across some of her books. Both of my degrees are in literature. So when I was in graduate school and I was going to Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, and they had one of the best things about that city was they had so many fabulous used bookstores. Yeah. And there was one that had a pile of Jane Rule books. And I brought them home. And this was, for people who have listened to the podcast, this was when I 100% thought I was straight. They all know that. But I was just drawn to these books. And I didn't know why, but her writing was so clear and so powerful and so beautiful and persuasive. And I'm kind of sad that I didn't end up keeping them just because they didn't make it in moves across the country. Yeah. But I can definitely relate that she just had such a way with her stories.
Mm-hmm. One of the things about Jane Rule is, for me, her moral world. This is the first time I read a book about lesbians where there was a whole ethical construct. And it really impressed me. What can I say? It really impressed me. And helped me see, another step toward what I wanted to say. But I never thought I could, be anything like as morally instructive and a good word for dogmatic. This is the way it is.
Yeah, just the whole ethos of what she was writing?
Yes. This is a standard we can go by. And I couldn't tell you what exactly in the book did that. That's what impressed me most.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess I'm just wondering, when did you start writing in relation to these books that you were reading? And was there any one book that kind of made you feel like it's time?
I started writing when I was in 8th grade. I was 13, and I wrote poetry. And then when I came out, I wrote love poetry with no pronouns. It's a very normal progression. I didn't believe I could write fiction. It was just too overwhelming a thought. So I kept writing this love poetry. And, tried a couple of little short stories. The latter ran at least one. And then Judy Grahn came to New Haven, where I was living, and did a reading, and she stayed in our women's collective. I prevailed upon her to get to take my manuscript, a little manuscript of poetry. And she came back saying, I don't remember what else, but the salient thing for me was, have you ever thought of writing fiction? Because obviously I must have been writing stories and poems. And that gave me the courage to try that, and Barbara Greer. Once I started writing short stories, I would send them to her. Because there was no outlet for lesbian short stories after the latter died. And she thought I was, the lesbian John O'Hara. So that was very encouraging. And that gave, so it wasn't, this is time, it was where life led me. And then I sent a story to Sinister Wisdom, which was fairly new at the time. And they accepted it. And gave me praise and encouragement. And meanwhile, Catherine and Harriet, who had started Sinister Wisdom, turned over editing to Adrienne Rich and Michelle Cliff. So the next time I sent a story, which was the short story, The Swashbuckler, they accepted that. And Adrienne said, no, it was Toothpick House. I sent the short story, Toothpick House. And Adrienne said, this could be the germ of a novel. So that gave me the courage to take the next step.
Oh, I'm so glad. Well, I mean, you I'm sure saw my review and know how much I fell in love with Annie. She was just so wonderful.
I don't understand that at all, but that's because I'm bored.
Well, I guess I just kind of like that she was this giant walking ball of feelings. And she wasn't afraid to have feelings and to share them and to be so, like, she, so often in fiction, butch women are just these like really buttoned up, like there can be those stereotypes sometimes in fiction of like not being as feeling, and I just felt like she blew all those stereotypes out of the water.
Good. I'm glad she did. I don't know where I found her. I've always felt like, the words come through me, that they're not mine, that they're somehow needed, and therefore I was given the gift of being able to put them on paper.
That makes a lot of sense. So almost like these characters come to you and you're just channeling them and giving them a way out in the world. Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense because of the 3 books that I've read, the characters are all incredibly distinctive. Like, I wouldn't say you have a type. I'm sorry, I'm not supposed to fangirl at you. The whole point of this is to let you talk. Not to gush
thank
at
you.
Anyway.
It's good. No, what you did is you're encouraging more books, so it serves a purpose.
Yes. Yes. I like to hear that. So what would you say were some other, just I guess to get back to kind of the whole point of the conversation, what were some other books that, again, just like really touched you, that really stood out, that you think are those books that they're just kind of timeless, that people should pick up?
Oh, gosh. Isabelle Miller, A Place for Us, had an enormous impact on, I think, everybody who read it. Historical romance? Would you call it a Oh, it's not called A Place for Us. It's Patience and Sarah now. The original title was A Place for Us, which is a line from Leonard Bernstein's West Side Story, which was one of those suspiciously variant Broadway shows and films.
I only just saw the movie for the first time a couple of weeks ago.
Wasn't it incredible?
It was so good. Well, I was talking to Neil. We have 2 young daughters, which means we have to be careful what movies we watch around around them. And so we started watching older movies because they're often safer to watch around small kids, and we had our 3-year-old kind of toddling around. So we put that, and I had never ever seen it, and he said, you have to see it. So I was watching it, and with the Jets, there's that one young woman that runs with them, and I was like, I'm pretty sure she's supposed to be gay.
And they looked like my era of coming out. The pompadours and all that. That's kind of an influence on Frenchie, although, well, lesbians look like that, some lesbians.
Right.
Just like these dancing boys.
Yes. Well, and that was, I actually kind of imagined Frenchie. Not necessarily that she would run with either of those gangs, but
No.
yeah, it felt right. So, can you tell us a little bit about Patience and Sarah?
Well, first of all, it was another gift from Barbara Greer, who knew Isabelle Miller. I never remember her real name. And I actually got to not meet her, but talk with her on the phone. It just amazes me that I knew these people, these women, these lesbian writers. My first partner, Susie, just died a few months ago. And when I see my life through her eyes, because she was also passionate about lesbian books, I have done this. I know these people. Catherine Forrest is a friend, and Carrie Colemaker, and all these other people we interviewed. I still think of me as little Lee from Flushing, New York, living in an apartment with my parents who didn't know a thing, and Anyway, Patience and Sarah. One of the most important things about that book for me was how she marketed it, how she took it to bars and shopping bags and sold it there. And I can't imagine a better strategy. And that's, you have her selling this early lesbian classic in a bar, and then you have Michigan, many years later, and vendors and vendors lined up selling lesbian books. It's like a miracle, it's started with one woman and one shopping bag, and now we have Goldstrokes books and Bywater books, Delva books. The book itself, I just remember the feelings I had. It was back then, I was going to say it was very erotic to me. Back then, when Radclyffe Hall closed the door and they were not seeing the rest of the night, that was a real turn on, emotionally and sensually. Mm-hmm. And the same with Millie's book. It spoke of love, the love I understood. The sensuality was not something I ever thought I would portray. But because it was so meaningful to me, then I wanted, again, to give it to other lesbians. So that's one thing I got out of Patience and Sarah. The fact that it got picked up by a big publisher was really astonishing. But then, of course, Jane Rule was published by a big publisher. But, by that time she was practically a Canadian. And these things happened in Canada. They didn't happen in America.
We're an intrepid country, I guess.
Was it Toronto where the gay bookstore wasn't able to get books in the States because of border control? They wouldn't let them through. It went on for years, and the bookstore sued whoever you sue about those kinds of things. Had you heard about that?
I hadn't heard about that, but if it wasn't Toronto, it would have been Vancouver.
Yeah,
but it was probably Toronto.
The West Coast didn't exist for me back then, or had just begun to exist. So yeah, Isabelle Miller was another big one. I loved the characters, and she did butch femme without calling them butch femme, which I could identify with. Carson McCullers, member of the wedding. Now this goes back a ways. This was again like junior high. Have you read Member of the Wedding?
No.
This was something that I read very young, and it's not supposedly not a lesbian book, but Carson McCullers was at least bi. And this is the story of a little girl who feels like an outsider, acts like a tomboy, and it's beautifully done. Not what I'd call a happy ending, but the portrayal of the lesbian child is very precious. where do you start calling books lesbian books? Like when I read Willa Cather, I immediately knew she was a lesbian. And, for example, in my Antonia, that the male main character was Willa Cather. It was just so clear. But, it's not called a lesbian book. It's not called lesbian literature, but it is. It's the way she had to write. Because, of course, she was a lesbian. And not so secretive about it. And probably you'd like me to go into more contemporary books, and I'm trying to think of some.
Honestly, it's up to you. I'm just happy to hear about your journey as a reader and what it meant for you. What has it meant for you in your life in whatever periods you want to talk about?
I've been very excited recently. Within the last few years, I was fortunate enough to read Cathy Frizzell's Prohibition era book, McLaughlin. I forget what she ended up calling the title. I mean, she has since written romances, but this book is really, really got to me. It was, she obviously done the research really, really well, and being a Southie herself from South Boston, and talking about that era in that area, very realistic. And the main character was, as strong as Frenchie, I think. I'm not a romance reader. I'm not a science fiction reader. General fiction is my thing. And Anne McMahon, who she creates these wonderful characters. She's funny. She's literate. She deals with social issues. And she's a wonderful person, too.
She is one of my absolute hands-down favorite authors in the whole world. And Who's Your Daddy is actually my favorite book. Mm-hmm. I have gone on at length on this podcast about how much I love her books. I've actually had her on the podcast and managed to not embarrass myself too badly. But the thing with Who's Your Daddy, when I picked it up, because have you read that one?
No.
It's the one that she wrote with her wife. So it takes place in this small town in Indiana, and it's a small town that's like, mm-hmm. There's a bunch of farmers, but it's also has auto manufacturing plants. Mm. And I grew up on the Windsor-Detroit border, and my dad worked in auto factories. There's lots of auto factories there, but my grandparents were also farmers. And so when I picked up that book, it felt like they wrote my experience, even though it was different. And then I just kind of gobbled all of her books that I could. And Backcast was the one that really just blew me away, mm-hmm. that it could be so funny, but also so thoughtful, and what was going on, the interplay between each of the essays in each chapter, and then what was happening with the women as they were writing the essays, and just that idea of like what you keep secret versus what you reveal, and whether you reveal it or not, it's still a part of your identity. Yeah. I have a lot of feelings about that book.
Beautifully done. And Phoebe got her way to my heart. The fish.
Oh, yeah. Yep. I cannot look at or hear about Aspic the same way since reading about Phoebe. So, is there anything about the current state of lesbian publishing that has you excited or encouraged?
Besides Anne McMahon.
Besides Anne McMahon.
Yes, because of Golden Crown Literary Society, which is teaching and encouraging and wants readers involved. And we have yes, of course I'm excited. We have a lesbian literary community, and we're developing some standards. I love what Golden Crown is doing. They're trying to do. They're getting more and more professional, but I'm always afraid we're going to step over that line. I don't want to get into being academics, Although the women in academia that are teaching lesbian literature, like Lee Lynch, and
yes,
I don't know. It's just, you see, I'm a 60s kid, always against the establishment, always suspicious of capitalism. I don't, not that I want to be a socialist or a communist or anything like that. It just, everything's about the bottom line these days. I wasn't making money for Nightwood. My books don't sell. They sell very little. They're going to sell for a long, long time. But right now, I'm just so grateful that Bold Strokes so far has been willing to publish. There was a gap in there. After Nightwood, life was not good. It took me a while to get back into writing, and who changed that is Diane Anderson Minshall, who's written with her partner Blind Eye series, is that what it's called? Of mysteries. But she's also like an editor at The Advocate. She was editor at Curve magazine, or was it Girlfriends? In any case, here I am, just not knowing what to do in the world anymore. I had a couple of books with New Victoria. I had someone interested in Sweet Creek, but that didn't work out. And Connie and Shelley. Shelley Thrasher is a writer, and her partner Connie Ward. They came to a reading in Houston, and they kept in touch. I love this reading. At that time, Connie was not a writer. She was a poet. I don't know if she had anything published. Not Connie, Shelley. And they kept in touch over the years, and all of a sudden they were involved with Bold Strokes Books and encouraged me to go to Radclyffe, who took me on right away, and has just been so supportive. And I keep saying things to her like, I don't know why you bother with me and not making any money.
And she probably said, because you're Lee Lynch and your books have been greatly important to me or something like that.
She said, I just remember this phrase yet, because you're a terrific writer and something. I don't know. But I don't care.
Well, I mean, your books are important. I think a lot of lesbian books are important, but I mean...
Yeah.
I think that writing lesbian romance is still a political act. And writing lesbian books that aren't romance is also a political act. Especially as, like, things got a lot better for a while, but it looks like things are kind of getting worse. But kind of almost regardless of what's happening with politics, it's still important for people to be able to pick up books and find themselves on the page. And to be able to either find, like, I actually think really fluffy, low-stakes romances are important because they can be like self-care. Like, reading those books to get away from the world, to forget that ugly things are happening is really important. But I think also having those more difficult, challenging literary works or genre fiction works, not genre fiction, general fiction works, are also important because we do still need to be challenged. And I think that's kind of where your books fit in, because they are different from the romances that are being published, but we need that. Like, we need to see that representation. We need to see those different women that may not be showing up in the romances. But that readers are going to see, they're going to find themselves on the page.
I totally agree with you. I think the more lesbian books we have out there, the harder it's going to be able to burn them all. And also, as I said, when I started, that's all I wanted to do was, well, maybe I didn't say it exactly what you said. Take the reader out of the world and into a better world, preferably that reflected them and their experiences. And if romances do it for some women, that's wonderful. That's great. It's just not my thing. They don't engage me.
Well, I mean, thrillers don't do it at all for me, and I know that they are some of the most immersive books there is, so I understand where you're coming from.
Ellen Hart, her books are important.
Mm-hmm.
And Sandra Scapitone. Are you familiar with her?
No, I don't think I've heard of her.
Okay, she wrote mysteries with a lesbian main character. It might be back in the 70s. She originally wrote under the name Jack Early, a father and daughter detective team. But then she moved to the lesbian character. And so that was important to me to find a lesbian mystery. Good lesbian mysteries. Because I'm a mystery reader. And sometimes a thriller, but mostly spy. I like spy mystery. John le Carré. So, genre books are important to me.
So, is there anything else, just to close off, is there anything else that you would want to say about your journey as a reader?
Everything is so different now. I would like to think that lesbians remember that history is cyclical, that we can't take for granted the freedom we have to write now and to publish and to read. And so it's really important for every reader out there who wants to write to do it, whatever the consequences, whatever the ambition, and that we acknowledge these writers, that we send fan mails or email, whatever, the writers who really reach us, whether they're writing Kate Culpepper worlds. And if you haven't read Kate Culpepper, you need to do that.
Oh, I'll take that tip.
She was a friend, but I read her books because I don't read that kind of stuff. But I know it was very meaningful to a lot of women. Andy Marquette has been writing on Women in Words, that blog, about where she wants to go with her writing. And it's like, we're in a place where it's just go. Just go. Do the writing. And on the reader's part, do the support stuff. Because without readers, the writers are nothing. And without readers' encouragement, you just end up like I am, like all writers are half the time, saying, "Oh, my books are, worthless. They mean nothing. I can't do it anymore." And that's happening to me right now. Are my current books, are they as important as the early books? Am I capable anymore? Anyway, that's not what you asked, but yeah, we gotta just do it and support each other doing it, and no fighting. Everybody be nice to everybody else. That's a terrible way to end it.
So, where can people find you?
Boldstroke Books, online, boldstrokebooks.com. Bella Books is the distributor for Boldstroke Books. Independent bookstores order books. Some libraries, and ask your libraries to order lesbian books.
I think that is all for this episode. Thank you so much, Lee, for joining me.
I thank you, Tara. Thank you for all your work and for your passion for our books.
Oh, thank you. So, I'm Tara. You've been listening to Les Do Books. Remember to email me at tara@thelesbianreview.com with your questions or comments. If you're an author who's interested in joining me on this show to talk about the lesfic you love or the trends that have you interested, please let me know. If you've enjoyed this episode, please check out the show notes where you'll find a Patreon link for the Lesbian Talk Show. Just a little bit would go a long way to cover hosting costs for Les Do Books and the other shows on the channel, and you'll also get access to premium content that you wouldn't get otherwise. You can find this and many other great shows by searching for the Lesbian Talk Show on iTunes, Podbean, or Stitcher, and you can find all the podcasters from the channel on Facebook in the group The Lesbian Talk Show Chat Group. You can also join our Facebook group, The Lesbian Review Book Club, to talk about these books and anything else you're reading and loving.